why we really wanted to bring him here today is you've heard us talk about learner-centric design. And again, if you do that, equity ideally is almost just an externality. You'll get there. But we really want to dig in with John about how we focus on the learners and on the learner, and particularly, frankly, the ones that we as a society usually don't do right by: people of color, people who are low income, people who are first generation. And to make these work, we have to get it right with these populations. That's not an add-on. It's got to be central to the design at the beginning. And I know that's very deep in each of your hearts. And so I think having John kind of focus on that. And again, John can hit this from a number of different angles, whether that be from the education side, the policy side, local, state, federal. And so we're really thankful to have him. I won't embarrass him further. But John, where I really want to start is I want you to talk about the learner for a second. And I want you to talk about, again, our kind of typical, and there is no typical community college student, but when we think about these populations in higher education in this time of COVID, can you talk about what is happening with them right now? Because I think, again, we're in a maelstrom right now, and it's again a little hard at times to figure out what is happening with the learner. Give us your sense of that from what you see in the data, and also what you see anecdotally from your work across the country.
Sure. And first, thanks to you for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. And congratulations to all of the schools that are participating. You all know the students served by community colleges are facing extraordinary challenges in this moment, really, as we're at this intersection of multiple pandemics. We have the impact of COVID, which has had a disparate health impact on communities of color. Folks of color, African American and Latino folks, are 3 times likely to get COVID, twice as likely to die from COVID when they do get it. There's been a disparate economic impact on communities of color and low-income communities. It's low-wage workers who've been most impacted by the closures that have been required for public health reasons. It's folks who are working in industries like hospitality or childcare who've been without jobs, without income. We see the skyrocketing unemployment numbers. We see the very rapid growth in food insecurity. We've got 14 million kids today in the country who are food insecure. So we have all of those stresses. Then we have the pandemic, really, of systemic racism that's been with our country from the beginning. And all the consequences that has in people's lives, and the intersection between COVID, the economic crisis, and systemic racism. So we know students are facing financial challenges, they are facing food insecurity, they're facing housing insecurity, and in many states, as eviction moratoria expire, we're going to see even higher rates of eviction and homelessness. We see students who are uncertain how their education connects with what they're going to do next, because maybe the jobs they were expecting to be able to pursue are in decline because of the economic crisis. So I think there's tremendous pain and uncertainty, as well as this sense that there are these great injustices around us, and an uncertainty as to whether or not the country is prepared to grapple seriously with those. So it's a lot, and I realize it is a lot for all the people who are gathered here, and I'm grateful for the work that you're doing to support students in this moment, and for the vision to say that we've got to create more pathways for folks to economic opportunity.
I think one of the big kind of table stakes for us for these micro pathways is 2 things. One, being fast enough and effective enough to have value out there in the market, meaning that we can basically put together 2 or more stackable credentials that are delivered effectively enough and quickly enough to get someone a job. Because we know right now, I mean, we are, from what I saw in the Department of Labor, about 10 million jobs down from February, if you look at it. And we know where that's hit the most. We also know, and I really want you to talk about this, we know that degrees, 2-year degrees, 4-year degrees, have particular power out in the market, and particular power out in the market for people of color. And so this is a quandary that many of these schools right now are dealing with in terms of how do we make sure that we can deliver something that's quick, effective, but also can be on the path to a degree that we do know for in many industries still does have value, and particularly for communities of color. I know you all have thought very deeply about this. So help us kind of square this circle. Tell us how you think about this. And again, how do we make sure we do what the market needs, which is in some ways what our learners need, but also we know what has long-term value for particularly the populations that have been left out for so long.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two things. One is that we have to make sure that there is a tight linkage between the learning experience and the marketplace demands. What we saw in the last recession, as you know, Chika, is that more than 95% of the good jobs that were created in the recovery from the 2008 recession went to people with college degrees. So one of the challenges we have is the degree has been the ticket to entry to good jobs very often certainly over the last decade. There are, however, these good jobs that are skills dependent where you don't necessarily need a degree, but often that is not where folks are focused in their course taking and their training. And we have millions of Americans who have some college credits, no degree, and really are lost economically. They can't go back to school because they can't get a good job with the credits that they have, but they also are dealing sometimes with debt from those credits that they've got, which they can't pay because they don't have a good job, so they're trapped. So one thing we have to do is have this tighter partnership with employers and make sure that the learning students are doing is going to translate into a credential that for the employer is meaningful, and where they know somebody has taken these courses, has had these apprenticeship or internship experiences, I can be confident they can do the job. But then secondly, we know that we're entering into a period of even more rapid change, if that can be imagined, given how much change we've experienced in the last quarter century. And the skills that you need today are not necessarily the skills that you'll need 10 years from now. And so this idea of the credentials being stackable and being tied to degree earning, I think is critical. So you want students to be able to access these rapid skill acquisition programs, but you want them to be able to use the credits they've earned, the experiences they've had towards an eventual degree, because later they may need to come back for that associate's or bachelor's, both to kind of preserve their competitiveness in the economy, but also maybe to move up in their job, be able to become a supervisor, become a manager, start a small business. And so one of the challenges has been that too often, I think in the last decade, job readiness programs that were short-term weren't linked to credit acquisition towards a degree. And so as soon as there was a change in the marketplace and that set of experiences wasn't as useful, students were sort of left in the lurch. And so I really appreciate that part of the design here is to deeply connect the career preparation with eventual degree earning.
So you said something really interesting, and I didn't mean to go down this road. I see Don Fraser here, and I'm going to ask a question I think will make him smile. Don Fraser, who's our Chief Program Officer, has led work for the past 5 years around the country on the credentialing of what we would call 21st century essential, soft, whatever you want to call them, but those non-technical skills that in many ways employers say are as or more important than the technical skills. This is my observation. I don't have the data to back it up, but I'm pretty sure that data would back it up. When we are talking about programs that are serving populations of color, folks who are low income, you see at times a tendency to hop over those skills. And so talk about what you've seen around those non-technical skills, again, foundations, a little soft, and how important they are to the work that we are doing. Because for us, that's a key part of the design. We want that to also be part of these micro pathways, because we keep hearing from employers, this is what cuts across all the roles. I need someone, if you give me someone who can collaborate and can communicate, it's kind of like almost, get me someone who's fast and I can put them in any position on the field. And so talk about that for a bit, because I think we gloss over this, particularly when we're talking about populations who we failed for a long time.
Yeah. Well, I think there's no question when you survey employers that they emphasize those soft skills issues. I think there is often a mismatch between the experience students are having in the classroom and that soft skill development, which really has to come through the hands-on project where you're working with a team of people. right? So you're practicing those kind of communication skills where you're writing, not necessarily a 10-page paper, but you're writing an email that's really clear, or you're recording what you did with a patient in a way that is really clear, right? And so I think one of the design challenges is how do you make sure the coursework actually builds those soft skills? Two, how do you make sure that faculty members have the training and professional development themselves to support that soft skill development now in a virtual learning environment often, which is challenging. There's I think a real risk of soft skills becoming a euphemism for some degree of implicit bias. And part of how we combat that is we make sure that we've done real faculty work around issues of implicit bias and race, and really thought about how do we build an anti-racist institutional culture? How do we ensure that we have faculty diversity so that folks are able to see themselves reflected in the faculty of the program? And then I think there's this other sort of daunting question for our society. How do we remove some of the obstacles that look like soft skills problems, but are really the structural consequences of systemic racism and an inequitable economy? So, here's a Maryland example that you know well. We have a real challenge around public transit in the state, a real lack of effective public transit. So if you live in Baltimore City, to get to your job may require changing buses 3 times. The buses are highly unreliable in their schedule. So you may be late. And when you walk in late, what people see is, oh, that's a soft skills problem around punctuality. Or maybe they have an implicit bias reaction. And they say, oh, well, that's because of who this person is, what their culture is, what their background is. But in point of fact, it's a failure of the public transit system. So there are ways, and I think, community colleges often have to think about this just to help students get through to their degree. We got to lower some of those obstacles. So I think about how CUNY and their ASAP program, which has doubled completion rates in community college, gives people Metro cards, which allows them to access the New York City subway to get to school, right? So how do we think about ways that we as institutions can help navigate some of these structural barriers for students? How do we advise students on navigating those structural barriers? That is, I think, a much more complicated but very real problem.
You've named a couple of things that I want to dive into really briefly. So one, the naming of that we don't use soft skills as a euphemism for bias, meaning, and I'll make it very tactical. I want someone who can communicate well, which can be in someone's mind, I mean, they communicate like I do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Those are two different things, but we can conflate those. And it definitely has been conflated. When, someone who's worked in corporate America, you a lot of times will hear about, oh, they weren't a good fit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a euphemism for all types of stuff that, frankly, people just don't want to put their finger on or say certain things out loud. And so that's, I think, really important. A couple of questions that come, and this actually, I'll help you go back in time a little bit. One of the critical partnerships that we see here, you named one of them being employers. Another one that we see here, and we're lucky to have the Walton Family Foundation be one of our supporters, is on the K-12 partnership, which we see as really, really critical. We were lucky we had PGCPS here yesterday from here in Maryland. So we have Prince George's Community College here. And we see that as a critical partnership. One, frankly, is pipeline. But secondly, and I forget which one of my colleagues from CUNY talked about this, but are there things that we can potentially push down into high school, for example, so that people arrive to us more ready so that they can spend more time, spend less Pell, so on and so forth. But I want to talk to you about how to make that partnership work. Again, there are lots of, no one means to fail. No one means to be a difficult partner, but I'm sure each of us on this call has a painful story about a K-12 partnership that didn't work with the community college. And so I would love to just hear from you as someone who's been on now kind of both sides of that, all sides of that. How do we make those partnerships work and effectively, particularly again for students who most need it? Because I think this is what all these leaders are going to be working on over the next 2 years, and frankly, been doing for their entire careers.
Yeah. It is challenging to have these partnerships work effectively across sector. A couple examples that I think are promising. There's an initiative, which I'm sure many folks in the room know about, a partnership between IBM, City University of New York, and the New York City Department of Education that has now been scaled around the country. It's operating in a number of places, called PTech. In the PTech process, students earn high school diploma, associate's degree, and they're first in line for a job with the employer partner. Began with IBM and now has expanded to dozens of employers around the country. There are PTech schools in Chicago, in Colorado, in Maryland. So PTech is growing. And some things they've done that are smart that I think we can learn from. One is real intentionality from the employer about relationships between employees and high school students, a mentoring relationship, so that students can see what is possible for them. I always think about the student I talked to at the original PTech school in Brooklyn, who said to me, I know I want to be an engineer at IBM because I want to drive the car that my IBM mentor drives, right? It was very clear. Like he had a vision for what 25 was going to look like for him. And that grew out of the relationship with the IBM mentor. Two, there was a real intentionality in the curriculum design. And so in the original school, folks from IBM were at the table with the CUNY faculty and the high school teachers designing, well, what should the math curriculum look like if it's going to prepare students with the skills they would need for an entry-level job at IBM? And that they've replicated now with these other employers. So that sort of course design collaboration, I think, is critical. Another different example, we have many places around the country that are doing work on dual enrollment. And what we see helps dual enrollment programs be more successful is picking the right faculty members who see their work as preparing students not only to get the course done, but to come to see themselves as college students, right? And so the faculty selection process and professional development process matters a lot. We also see in dual enrollment programs that support matters a lot, that students need additional, when they're taking on that college level work. We see this also in high school career tech ed programs. For students to be successful, they not only need the in-classroom experience, but they also need coaching, mentoring, tutoring, and those supports, when they're in place, can be the difference between whether or not historically underserved students are successful in those programs.
No, I think this is really, really important. Again, we're beginning to have these types of conversations now, and I think one of the things that I hear you talking about is the importance of that non-technical piece, whether that be the relationships with employers, with employees, and that's actually really important. That's probably the first time I've heard it during this kickoff, which is, we're going to be having lots of conversations with hiring managers, with HR folks about how do we get folks in. I think about my colleagues at CUNY who've worked with their CEO Jobs Council to bring those folks to the table. But having those lower level connections with an employee are actually really critical for a student. One, as we know, one of our advisory, our ACT co-chair, Jake Hirsch Allen from LinkedIn North America talks about this. 80% of Americans get a job without an application because they knew someone. Someone told them there was something open. Someone put in a good word, and having those relationships is really critical, particularly for these populations. I think secondly, what I've heard you talk about is really how do we think about those systems of other supports that really are going to make students successful. You talked about transportation. It's even more true here. Some community colleges just have to think about it. And so looking at all the research that I know that EdTrust has done, what are the, call it 1, 2, 3 supports that help a student make it through a program like this? Because these micro pathways will not be successful if students do not complete, if life gets in the way, as does. So talk about kind of what are some of those that you've seen make a real difference? Yeah.
Well, some things we know around the country, and this is true often for high school graduation and college completion and kind of credential completion, good advising, right? So students having a clear understanding of the relationship between the courses they're taking, the work that they're doing, and their long-term plan, critical. Removing financial obstacles. We talked about transportation. Housing insecurity is a significant issue, helping people navigate getting access to housing subsidies, getting access to food subsidies. We know, for example, that students in career programs in many states are eligible for SNAP benefits, but don't always know how to navigate taking advantage of those. So the sort of one-stop shop or single-stop vision where the higher ed institution is helping students kind of manage the sort of financial challenges. Childcare, you know, a fifth of our college students are parents. Certainly many of our working adults who are coming back for additional education are parents. Finding childcare and then finding childcare subsidies, often a very significant challenge for folks. Emergencies, you know, one of the things that we see in lots of places is that financial emergencies come up and folks, everything falls apart when the financial emergency happens. You know, so my car breaks down. Well, now I can't get to my coursework. I can't get to my internship or my apprenticeship opportunity. I got to pay for the car repairs. And now I also can't pay my tuition and fees and so forth. So I think about Georgia State, which has closed their degree completion gap on race and income largely, in part through better advising, in part through what they call Panther grants, these just-in-time emergency financial grants that help people navigate those crises in their lives. The access to timely, well-designed academic support. In many places, as everyone in this room knows, remediation is a dead end and leads students to nowhere. We are seeing some promise with co-requisite programs that both remediate where students have gaps and help them access content that is credit-bearing coursework. Ideally, if we're going to serve the most vulnerable students, we're going to have students who are going to come with real deficits in their writing skills, in their reading skills. If we don't want those students to just wash out, we have to provide supports, but in the context where they still feel like they're making progress towards the goal of the credential or the goal of the degree. So those are a few of the things. Ultimately, I hope one of the things, and I know this is something that a value you live, Chike, I hope one of the things that institutions that are participating in this project will do is keep asking this question. Right, constantly ask, where are we seeing breakdowns? If a student leaves, let's do an exit interview and understand what happened, what went wrong, what was missing for them, what did they need that they didn't get. There should be a lot of data generated, right, on not only student success in the credential program, but then the employer's experience when they come to work for them. What are they seeing? What strengths, what gaps, so that there's a continuous improvement culture.
Absolutely, and part of, again, the design thinking process that we live here is there's a process of testing and iteration. You have to, in the end, in industry, the customer is changing, and in this work, the learner is always changing, and we have to be able to design around them and iterate, and never, you know, and there never is an end, there never is a done. Let me end off with the last question, and again, you all have a report that you all have unveiled today that I actually think goes into the big question that we've had over the last couple of days, and then and I'm prepping her for the cold call now. I'll throw our first question to Kathleen Delaski, who's our founder. Kathleen, I'm prepping you now, and for those of you who don't like the cold calls, you can blame John, because that's where I first learned it in classrooms and in schools that he ran. But one of the biggest barriers we know, and you talked about it a little bit, is financing. We know that, if I remember the data correctly from Delta Cost years ago, we know that if you look at why students don't finish, more than half the reason, I believe was 51% when they calculated it through the regression, was financing. And I think something that everyone on this call lives. I know you've unveiled a big report today. Please, and we'll actually make this available afterward. We'll likely put it on the site. I believe it actually launched today. Would love to have you talk about that, and then talk about how some of those insights impact this work. Again, we're going to be working with 4,000 new majority learners, at least over the next 2 years. And this is that we know, we literally have talked, this come up on every day that we've had this. We'd love to have you talk about that and see how it reverberates on some of the work that we are about to embark on.
Yeah. Well, look, let's first acknowledge that we have a real structural problem and that the country dramatically underinvests in public higher education, and in particular, dramatically underinvests in community colleges. Center for American Progress did an analysis that showed states are spending, that the combined efforts of states and federal efforts result in community colleges being underfunded at something like $8,800 less per student than four-year institutions, which translates into a $70 billion gap in funding. So let's acknowledge that the federal government and states are failing, from my perspective, to invest adequately in our community colleges, which are vital to the success of our economy and our democracy. Let's also acknowledge that in 1980, Pell Grants accounted for about 80% of the cost of a public four-year college degree. Today, Pell Grants account for about 28% of the cost. The diminished purchasing power of the Pell Grant is a huge problem. We ought to at least double the Pell Grants. That would make a huge difference for students. So that's the context in which states are trying to innovate around college affordability. And the report today is on free college programs. And essentially, our position at Trust has been, if what we mean by free college is we're going to help historically underserved students, low-income students, afford and complete college, we're for that. But if free college is a bait and switch gimmick to steer resources towards affluent students, well, we're against that. And the problem is, the reality in the country is free college means lots of different things. And so the report today really looks at the design of free college programs and tries to figure out, are these programs serving low-income students? So for example, in many states, the free college program is actually a last dollar program that is only available to the students who aren't getting, basically only goes to students who aren't already getting other financial aid to cover tuition. And so the free college program is actually steering dollars not to the highest need students. So we critique that. In this report, we identify programs that are doing a better job getting money to low-income students. We look at programs that are removing obstacles for working adults to take advantage. In some states, the free college program is only available to students immediately after high school graduation. We think that's problematic. We look at whether or not free college programs are available to undocumented students, to incarcerated students, and we evaluate them on their sort of equity focus. We highlight as maybe the best example the Washington State program. And I think it's particularly relevant to folks in this audience. What Washington State did was they focused their resources on low-income students. They paid for their, what they call the Washington College Grant, through a small tax on employers with high-skilled workforces. And essentially the idea was that the employers who have high-skilled workforces are benefiting from the investments in human capital, so they ought to contribute a little bit more. And Microsoft, to their credit, was a real leader in getting the Washington College Grant Program launched, and said, raised their hand and said, we'll pay more if we know will translate into a better prepared workforce. So we highlight that as an example of a model that we hope other states will follow. And ultimately, we'll see how the next few weeks plays out, but hopefully there's a conversation in Congress in the next year about how we could have a state-federal partnership that would do a much better job subsidizing higher education opportunities for low-income students.
Oh, thank you so much for that, John. And let me turn it, because and Kathleen, I did prepare you. Would love to have you, and again, Kathleen is our intrepid leader and founder, and we are here because of her effort and leadership. Love to have you kick off our Q&A period.
Wow, I'm blushing like crazy over that statement, Chike. Thank you. And John, we followed your work throughout your many stops along the way of working towards equitable futures. I was going to ask you about, we try not to get political here, but I was going to ask you whether you thought that a potential Biden administration would be would help solve the solution that we are trying to come up with around micro pathways. And you talked about free college, and that's obviously one of the things on the table, or free community college. Where do you think our effort or our belief that micro pathways are a recognition that this is where demand is going, and that we need to structure around that demand more market signaling that and help the cultural understanding around what is the value of something that is less than a degree, and let's package it in a way that makes it valuable. Where does that fit in, do you think, into a world that might be going to free community college, or might be changing pretty dramatically in a new administration? Where does this initiative fit in, do you think?
Yeah, there are probably three opportunities I would flag, and a lot depends not only on the presidential election outcome, but the Senate race outcome as well. But there's one, the potential for a conversation about short-term Pell and reducing the minimum number of weeks necessary to qualify for Pell dollars in a way that might allow credential programs to get better access to Pell dollars. At Ed Trust, we would say that has to be done in conjunction with some very important work on accountability and transparency. For us, that means the College Transparency Act, which would allow us to have a student unit record and be able to track not only completion outcomes for students, but also their success in the workforce, their ability to pay down any debt that they have, so that we can promote the programs that are good and we can shut down the bad actors, right? So hopefully there's an opportunity there. Second, I think there's a potential opportunity around infrastructure. If there were to be a significant investment in infrastructure, which we desperately need, both to address issues like the public transit issue that Chika and I were discussing, but also to address how we move away from carbon and move towards renewables and try to reduce the likelihood that the planet continues to get hotter and hotter and we have more of these wildfires and hurricanes and so forth. If there's a big infrastructure investment, I think there could be a way to build some education investments into that with employer partners. To my mind, that should be a part of how we think about an infrastructure bill. Preparing folks for green jobs. There are some green jobs that require very intensive skill development, but there are some, the solar panel installer that you might imagine folks could be prepared for with less intensive long-term skill development. And there might be jobs where you're helping folks retool who are in industries. The folks who work in the coal industry, for example, are going to need new jobs. And can you give them new skills through short-term credential programs that would allow them to move into green jobs? So that infrastructure opportunity is a second possibility. The third is, if there is a free college effort, a free community college, debt-free college, it will be a federal-state partnership. There's an opportunity to require states to do more investment in public higher ed as a part of that. And there's an opportunity to say, here are all the things you need to do to better support students as a part of this federal-state partnership. So in the Obama administration, when we proposed America's College Promise, which would have been tuition-free community college, it came with the strength that states had to do more to support students through to completion. And we know a lot from CUNY ASAP, from Georgia State, about what it takes to get students to completion. The University Innovation Alliance, we ought to scale those practices. That was part of our vision of what a state-federal partnership should mean. I think that could be a part of a conversation in the next Congress.
No, John, thank you for that, and I will editorialize for a second. I've what you said about infrastructure, any public investment, I think is really important, because in the end, someone builds the road, someone places the panel, and so I've gone as far as to say that for every dollar of infrastructure spending, we should literally have a ratio that should be pegged to training for that. whether it's 10 cents, 20 cents, I don't know. I have experts, smart people on this call, but that needs to, from a policy perspective, putting on my old policy hat, I think it's super, super critical. I want to ask a question that came from our colleague, Nisha, who's at Gutman College at CUNY. We talked a little bit about implicit bias among employers. And kind of basically her question is, have we seen deep work around implicit and explicit bias in the workplace? And I want to throw it to you, John. I'll add this on the front end. I think, I'll be frank, I think I have begun to see serious work in the last 2 or 3 years for this reason and potentially this reason only, which is we have seen it in certain professions where the demand where the supply shortage is so painful, where folks say, I've got to do something different. I've spent a lot of my time working in or near technology. And so you see this in a regular basis where you've seen companies that I never thought would get rid of degree requirements, resume requirements. You literally see Google creating credentials out of thin air because they say, we will do anything. We've seen folks do deep partnerships with HBCUs because of, hey, my demand shortages are just so painful. 1. 2, this is a place where transparency and pressure has helped. One of the other things that happened in 2013, 2014 is that finally I believe Twitter was the first to release their diversity data, and it was terrible. There was literally no way to justify this, and Twitter didn't even try. And so those are 2 things that I think have been pressures on countering implicit and explicit bias. But John, again, you're looking at this from, again, the perspective of education institutions. Talk about what you've seen and not seen, or what you hope to see in terms of combating bias in all forms.
Yes, a lot more rhetoric than reality, right? I mean, you think about this spring, after the murder of George Floyd, you had virtually every college, foundation, major Fortune 500 company put out some statement of sort of solidarity with protesters, statement of concern about issues of racial justice. I don't know that many people have turned that into changing their internal HR practices. And so I think there's a real gap. Some things that are promising, a number of states are considering or have passed, Maryland passed, a Crown Act saying you can't discriminate against people based on their hairstyle, right? So that's the public sector saying we're gonna prevent this discriminatory behavior. I think that's important, and I'm hopeful that we will see more of that, folks removing discriminatory behavior through law. Hopefully, in a potential new administration, there'd be a reinvigoration of civil rights enforcement generally. We've seen over the last 4 years a real retreat from civil rights enforcement. So there's an opportunity there. We have some state attorneys general who are doing a good job, I think, on pursuing discrimination issues in the workplace, but not enough. There are companies, I think, and you're right about the tech sector, that are trying to build partnerships that will change the pipeline. I still worry they haven't necessarily gotten at the practices, because if you look, there are actually a lot of African-American computer science graduates nationally. They still aren't getting jobs in Silicon Valley, right? And so changing who gets hired and how they get hired, the role of sort of bias in those processes it takes, I think, a higher degree of commitment, and we haven't necessarily seen that. Now, we talked about the importance of employees engaging with the students who are part of this project. One of the benefits of that is to lower some of the fear and the role of fear and bias in people's interactions. Urban Alliance runs these programs for high school students with employers, and they have programs in DC and Baltimore and I think in Chicago. And one of the things that Urban Alliance often says is that when you say we're going to have these high school students of color who are going to come and be interns, you can see that some people are nervous about interacting with teenagers, And that's real. I have a 9th and 12th grader. I get that. Teenagers make people nervous, but also some of that is about race and class and assumptions about who kids will be. And what happens is then the Urban Alliance interns come and the employees love them and they can't wait for them to come back and they're excited about them. And so those young people, when they're then applying for a job coming out of college, they're going to have that network that many of their peers won't have. It's great that Urban Alliance is doing that, but it's a question of exposure. So I think to the extent that we're able to get folks working alongside people who are different from them, it sort of lowers the role of fear and bias. So there are some bright spots. There are some law changes that are hopeful, but we still have a long way to go. The last thing I'd say is, this is outside the control of the groups in the room, but as a society, we also just undervalue the jobs in which people of color and women of color in particular are disproportionately concentrated, right? So childcare and elder care, for example, are fields in which there are lots of low-income women of color. And we just should be paying folks more to do that vital work to society. And that's outside of the credential question, but as citizens, we all should be outraged that in many states, you can make more doing nails than you can make as an early childhood educator.
No, I think you hit on a very important point, and I think that is what you say name is a phenomenon I think we see across all the regions that we work in, whether it be Seattle, whether it be New York, whether it be Austin, whether it be Prince George's County, whether it be Indiana. Let me ask you another question, and I'm gonna go a little deeper on the exposure piece, and I may have you step outside of your role here, and you've talked very eloquently about kind of the way that you grew up and the travails that you went through to get to where you are. And I would have you go back, and I want to link this back to the kind of the soft skill question. So I want to go back to that 14, 15, 16-year-old John King. And I want to think about what are those skills that you were exposed to, that you were able to learn, frankly, at those early ages, or the ones you didn't, and that made your life a little harder because you didn't have them. Because we're gonna be seeing that. We're gonna need to be thinking about how do we make sure that these students get those. And again, I think I'm going to say something that you didn't say, but I think it's what you would say, which is these essential skills are less taught; they're more trained. It's kind of like when you're an athlete and you have a coach who watches you and they say it this way next time. Or, hey, by the way, when this thing happened in the meeting, that's what that meant. I think we all have had someone do that for us. Then I realized, oh, shoot, I'm not going to do that again, or so on and so forth. But go back to you in the early part of your life. And again, I've heard you talk so powerfully about that. Talk about some of those skills and some of what some of those mentorship relationships looked like that got you that. Because as I think about all the schools that we're talking about, all of them are thinking about how do I include those into this and how do I structure them so that they're as powerful for the learner as possible?
Yeah. Well, a few thoughts on that. One is, as context, I was a mess in high school. My parents both passed away when I was a kid. My mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. And like many young people who experience trauma, I just was really angry as a teenager. I actually got kicked out of high school. I always point out to folks, first U.S. Secretary of Education, and kicked out of high school. And that was partly because my reaction to adult authority was so negative, and I was so distrustful of adults. I felt like adults had failed me at different points in my life, and I was really angry about that. And there were a few things that made a difference. One, there were teachers and mentors who were willing to see me as more than the sum of my mistakes and were willing to actually help me develop a sense of trust. And I feel like one of the challenges for employers, particularly when they're employing folks who have had a series of traumatic life experiences, is that they can very quickly feed into a cycle where people expect to be mistreated, are themselves skeptical of institutions, feel out of place, and then the employer reinforces that message,
Right.
or the school reinforces that message. So I think one of the goals here should be to help both the educators, the trainers, and the employers think about how do you build relationships of trust. In the context then of that relationship of trust, that's when you can then coach people on. So when this kind of thing happens, you can ask for help. And one of the things that I struggled with, and I think a lot of young people struggle with, is I thought asking for help was a sign of weakness. Right? But actually, part of what we want to train folks is that asking for help when something is confusing or you don't understand it, you don't know what to do next, is exactly the right kind of soft skill, right? But you need that relationship of trust as the foundation to then teach that. I would get very frustrated with peers and teachers and act on that frustration. I didn't necessarily have other strategies to resolve conflict and needed to learn those. So again, that's a critical soft skill. It's easier to teach when there is a context of trust. When the assumption is, yeah, there are going to be issues where you disagree with a coworker, and here's how we work through it. I'd also say, I think one of the things to really think about here is, how do you thoughtfully provide supports around the challenges that folks are going to face in their lives? I mean, think about all the students you will work with who have kids, and think about how hard it has been for parents to navigate virtual, hybrid. I mean, when we do polling, parent stress is through the roof, particularly parents of kids with disabilities. Just feeling bad about themselves as parents, don't know how to support their kids, don't have the resources, the tools. If somebody's carrying that with them and then they show up for their training program and they get some negative feedback, that's going to be tough. So I think thinking about how are you going to wrap around supports for folks is critical. That obviously was critical for me. I mean, if people hadn't supported me to give me a second chance and to help me kind of redirect my energies, I don't know if I'd be alive today. I certainly wouldn't be doing the things I'm doing.
So in our final couple of minutes before I kind of close this out, we gathered this group, one, because these are pioneering institutions who we think are going to show the way for a lot of the country. And really just doing that blocking and tackling, brass tacks work that we've talked about for the last hour. How do we really support learners through these pathways into work that's meaningful, so that they're not just getting a job, but they're getting a career and hopefully becoming leaders, not just employees, but employers along the way. But we also already have gathered the seeds of what we hope to be a constituency that can raise their voices and talk about some of the systemic issues that we've talked about here, whether that be on wage, whether that be on the way that we manage community colleges so that they can do some of this work. Again, things like short-term Pell and so on and so forth. From someone who's been at all the policy levels that there are to be at, and Kathleen and our colleague Rufus Glasper, who leads the League for Innovation in the Community College, they'll be leading a president's forum, but that will include broader leaders to raise our voice about some of these systemic issues. And so if you had to pick one, and I hate doing this, I always hate these questions, but I like asking them. If you had to pick one policy that they could raise their voice around and say, if we change this so that community colleges can better, frankly, create that economic mobility pathway that we talk about, what would that be?
Can I have two?
Because you hired me 15 years ago, I'm going to let you have two. I'm going to let you have two. I wouldn't be here without you, so go ahead.
Look, because as you pointed out, financial obstacles are the number one barrier for low-income folks in accessing and succeeding in higher ed. We have to provide more support. It is in our long-term interest as a society. So Pell Grant advocacy, doubling Pell would be, at least doubling Pell would be transformative. partly because it would not only help us to address the cost of tuition, but more importantly, it would help us to address the total cost of attendance, food, housing, books, fees, transportation, childcare, so forth. So, we have to, I think, put a tremendous amount of pressure on Congress and the next administration to deliver on an increase, a substantial increase in Pell. Second, I would say this better linkage between employers and higher ed institutions so that the higher ed experience translates into credentials that matter in the marketplace. I mean, I think the sad reality is that too many students, even with degrees, aren't able to get good jobs. Even community college completers aren't able to get good jobs that make family sustaining wages and provide decent benefits. Some of that is about the economy, but some of that is about just not having the connection between what they're doing and what they're doing in school and what they're ultimately going to do. It's also, I think, one of the reasons why folks stop out is they don't see the relationship between what they're doing in the classroom and how it will affect their career and create economic opportunity for their families. So if we could strengthen that connection in curriculum design, internship and apprenticeship experiences, how credits are awarded, how institutions are held accountable, I think that would go a long way. But we have to start with the financial piece.
So as I think all of you on the call can see, this is why we had John. Because again, I think what is again remarkable is that what you heard him say today are roughly the things I heard him say the first time I met him back in 2006. And again, rarely are people that consistent about things that are in service of their fellow human being. And so that's why we have him. And I just couldn't imagine. And honestly, thank you, John, for the work that you do, for being here with us today. And I think hopefully putting some wind in the sails of all the folks that we have here. And honestly, I encourage you, we have added the EdTrust report that we mentioned to our microsite. Please take a look at that. I think there are going to be some amazing best practices there. And honestly, John, we may not let you go. We may bring you back at some point, but honestly, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, TK. Thank you all.